A child sits at the kitchen table, a half-finished puzzle scattered in front of her. Her hand hovers near a piece that clearly fits the gap she has been staring at for several minutes. But she does not move it, and her eyes stay still and distant instead of searching. 10 minutes earlier, she solved a similar puzzle quickly and easily, smiling at her small victory. Now she seems unable to see what is right in front of her, and the reason is stranger than simple tiredness. The adults watching might call it frustration, stubbornness, or a sudden loss of confidence. But the science behind this frozen moment reveals something more precise and more hopeful. Something has been learned, and what has been learned can later be unlearned. The scientific name for this pattern is learned helplessness. The term sounds like a contradiction because how can helplessness truly be learned? Don't we enter the world naturally helpless and gradually learn to do things for ourselves? That is exactly what makes this phenomenon so important to understand from the ground up. In the late 1960s, researchers studying animal learning stumbled onto a discovery that changed our understanding of giving up. They were working with dogs, not because the dogs were special, but because the original question was a different one entirely. Some dogs were placed in a harness where they received an unpleasant electric shock they could not avoid or stop. No matter what the dogs did, bark, move, lie down, or press any part of the enclosure, the shock came and went on a fixed schedule. For those animals, the painful event was genuinely uncontrollable in that first setting. Other dogs were in the same harness, but could stop the shock by pressing a panel with their nose. And a third group of dogs received no shocks at all during that early phase. The researchers then moved all the dogs to a new situation, a box divided by a low barrier. A light would signal an upcoming shock, and the dog could simply step over the barrier to the safe side. Most dogs quickly learned to jump across as soon as the warning light appeared, but the dogs who had earlier faced inescapable shock behaved very differently in this new test. They lay down on the electrified floor, whimpered, and took the shock without trying to escape. They had learned in the first situation that nothing they did mattered at all, and that learning carried over into a completely new place where escape was actually possible. This was not a physical injury because the dogs were still physically able to move and jump. It was a change in their expectation, a belief so powerful it overrode the evidence right in front of them. The dog's behavior looked like sadness, but the mechanism was a specific kind of learning gone wrong. Psychologists later found that the same basic process occurs in human beings under certain conditions. In human experiments, participants who first tried to solve unsolvable puzzles later gave up much faster on solvable ones. And the experience of uncontrollable noise or social rejection can produce a very similar pattern. Now return your attention to the child at the kitchen table and her unmoving hand. The puzzle she solved a moment ago gave her a taste of control because her action produced a clear result. But the 3 puzzles before that one were impossible ones, chosen by a teacher who did not realize they were beyond her age. Each impossible puzzle taught her a silent and powerful lesson that your efforts fail here. When the possible puzzle appeared, her brain had already formed a general rule about these colored pieces and her own influence. The belief was not a thought she put into words, but a change in her nervous system's expectation of reward. Learned helplessness operates beneath conscious reasoning, quietly shaping what we notice and what we try. It distorts attention so the person stops scanning for ways to change the situation because past experience says scanning is useless. It alters emotion so a flat, drained feeling replaces the frustration that would normally fuel new attempts. And it changes behavior so passivity becomes the default, even when a simple action could bring relief or success. The child's brain is not damaged or weak. It is only adapting to a repeated message about the world. The tragedy is that the adaptation gets applied far outside the original classroom where the message was true. Over time, learned helplessness can reshape a person's entire story about who they are and what they deserve. A student who fails math puzzles starts believing I am bad at math as a permanent fact of identity. An employee who cannot please an unpredictable boss stops trying to offer ideas in any meeting at all. A person who faces repeated rejection may withdraw from connection even when friendly people are standing nearby. The helplessness generalizes, moving from one task to a whole category, and eventually to the entire sense of self. Psychologist Martin Seligman later identified 3 critical ingredients in how people explain the uncontrollable event to themselves. People who are most vulnerable to learned helplessness tend to see bad events as personal, permanent, and pervasive. Personal means it is my fault, and something must be deeply wrong with me specifically. Permanent means this will never change, no matter what I try or how hard I work. Pervasive means this single failure will inevitably ruin everything else in my life. A child who fails a test and thinks I am stupid, I will never understand math. I am probably bad at reading too, is digging a deep pit under her own feet. But what if that same child had a completely different explanation available in her mind? What if she could think, that test was especially hard today. I was very tired, and I still do well on my reading homework. The difference between those two explanations is the difference between collapsing into helplessness and brushing off a setback. This is a crucial insight because learned helplessness is not simply an automatic reflex. It is fueled by interpretation. And interpretations can be reshaped, even after years of practice, through careful and repeated experience. In the original animal experiments, researchers discovered they could physically move the dog's legs to help them escape the shock. After being forced to experience that the barrier could be crossed, many dogs started jumping across on their own. The direct bodily experience of control, not just thinking about it, rewrote the old expectation of helplessness. For humans, too, change often begins with a small, undeniable moment of genuine effectiveness. A therapist might help a depressed person plan one tiny achievable task like making the bed, writing one sentence, or walking to the mailbox. The action itself is small, but the psychological message it delivers is unexpectedly large because your behavior still shapes your world. Tools that use mastery-based learning, where students practice until they truly succeed, build a protective shield against learned helplessness. Coaches who highlight effort and improvement over fixed talent train young minds to see setbacks as temporary and changeable. Yet the reversal is not as simple as someone shouting, "Try harder," or demanding that you just be positive. If telling someone to try harder could fix learned helplessness, the painful condition would hardly exist for long. The deep problem is that the person's attention and brain reward systems have been carefully trained to expect failure. Simply providing a solvable puzzle is not enough if the child's mind is still filtering the world through the lens of her earlier failures. The reversal requires a new kind of evidence, repeated many times in a trustworthy and predictable environment. It requires what psychologists call attribution retraining, which means learning to argue back against the personal, permanent, and pervasive explanations. This is where the story of learned helplessness turns from a tale of damage into a genuine tale of resilience. The child at the table is not broken, lazy, or ungifted in any permanent sense. Her stillness is the living echo of 3 impossible puzzles, a memory held inside her hands and her expectations. What looks like giving up is actually a highly efficient brain strategy that conserves effort in a world where effort once led nowhere. The mistake is not in her powerful learning ability. The mistake is that her learning has not yet caught up with the change in her circumstances. This pattern once helped animals survive in harsh and uncontrollable environments by preventing exhausted struggling when it was truly useless. But human beings live inside more complex worlds where some problems are solvable today that were not solvable yesterday. The task of psychological growth is not to erase the lesson of helplessness, but to keep updating the lesson with fresh evidence. The frozen hand above the puzzle piece is not a permanent decision. It is a question waiting for a different and truer answer. And that answer can come from a single successful move, prompted by a gentle hand-over-hand guide or a shift in the puzzle's difficulty. When we see someone stuck in a pattern of not trying, the most compassionate question is not "why are you lazy?" but what past experiences taught you that effort will never work here. Because the behavior is learned, it can be unlearned, or more accurately, a new pattern can be relearned over time. Relearning does not erase the past. Instead, it builds new and stronger memories of effectiveness that compete with the old ones. The brain constantly updates its predictions, and each small success is a data point that insists control can be possible. For parents and teachers, the practical implication is powerful because you can structure tasks so that a child experiences mastery, not repeated failure. When a task must be hard, give support early and then gradually remove it so the child internalizes the feeling of genuine accomplishment. For anyone who recognizes this frozenness in themselves, the research offers a shift in perspective, not a quick magical fix. Your passivity may not be a personality flaw. It may be a perfectly understandable response to a history you have lived through. The feeling that nothing I do matters is not the truth about the whole world. It is a theory formed in one corner of it. You can gently test that theory by starting with one controllable action, no matter how small, and noticing the result without dismissing it. Sometimes, writing down 3 things that actually went as planned can be the first clear evidence against a long-held belief in universal helplessness. The child who finally places that piece, with a parent's patient hand beside hers, is not just solving a simple puzzle. And the uncomfortable truth is that we are all more like that child than we realize, carrying invisible lessons from rooms we left years ago. The room can change. The puzzle can suddenly become solvable once more. Our task is to notice when the evidence has shifted and to let our expectations shift with it, one small courageous action at a time.